Well, hey guys, this is Standard 1.6. Today we're going to talk about Hamilton, the musical. Well, kind of. We'll get into that. The question that we're looking at today is where in the world did we get the idea that we should have a two-party system? Okay. Why do we have Republicans and Democrats? And actually, the answer goes all the way back to the late 1700s in George Washington's cabinet. Okay, not his kitchen cabinet, but his political advisors. Um, in order for us to understand how that cabinet leads to the two-party system, we need to look at the beliefs of two guys, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Okay. Again, if you've seen the musical Hamilton, a lot of what we do today is wrapped up in one of the cabinet battles, and it's pretty cool. Okay. So we're going to look at their differences and explain how these beliefs led to two different parties. So just to give you a little bit of a background of where we are, the Articles of Confederation now is gone. The Constitution has been ratified. The Bill of Rights is included. George Washington has been elected president. And just to help you out here, George Washington feels very strongly that political parties are going to be a cancer to this country. His basic idea is if we have political parties, they're going to be factions that line up alongside each other, and just all they're going to do isn't focus on the issues. They're going to fight the other side. Sometimes they're not even going to know what the issues are, he says. They just know that they hate the other people and what their ideas are. And you know what? He's right. In 2020, we don't listen to each other very well. We just know that I like this guy and he says this, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay. So how did we get from George to two parties? Well, it all starts out as one big happy family. George Washington has to assemble some of the best and the brightest minds that he can possibly find for his cabinet to advise him. Because even though he's a great guy, he doesn't have all the intricate and intimate knowledge of all the various facets of governing. In other words, he needs somebody to tell him what to do with money stuff. So he needs a Secretary of the Treasury. And he says, Alexander Hamilton. Now, Hamilton is, he's a writer, he's a thinker, he's all about what do we need to do to get stuff happen. He makes things happen, which sometimes can be an issue. Like if you're the sort of person who just knows how to move things forward, you don't always do that equally for everybody. Okay? And Thomas Jefferson is that guy who says, you know what, we want to make sure that everybody's treated fairly. Let's take the time when we're making our plans to plan things out so that everybody's treated more or less the same. He's going to be the Secretary of State. That means he's going to advise Washington specifically when it comes to how do we handle other countries and issues that relate to other countries. Disagreements between these guys, as I've said, lead to the two-party system. Now, really quick, the notes today are actually in an Excel spreadsheet. You can find that in Google Classroom as of the recording of this. Excuse me. There is not a complete set of notes. If you need a complete set and you have a legitimate reason for that, shoot me an email and ask for it. The reason that I say that is that I want you to think through the various issues, okay, on your own. That'll help your brain kind of put some bookmarks there. You'll be like, oh, I've thought about this. If I just hand it to you, some of you guys will be like, okay. So again, I'm happy to give you a completed version. Shoot me an email to ask for it though. So let's dive in and talk about the issues that lead to this big division in the big happy family. So question number one has to do with state debts. A number of states, primarily in the South, had no debts, except for South Carolina. The North had some debt that they'd accrued over the years, especially under the Articles of Confederation. Alexander Hamilton says the federal government should just pay off the debts of all the states so that all the states are on the same footing. So there's economic stability in the North and in the South. Jefferson says, yeah, that's a pragmatic approach that gets stuff done, but it isn't fair. Okay? The government shouldn't pay off the state's debt because the South already paid theirs. Okay? Why in the world should the government pay off the debts of the North when the South already took care of it on their own? You say, I don't understand. Okay, so just let's say we have two people in the class. Okay, let's say we have, I don't know, Jack and Jill, right? Both of them get credit cards. Their very first credit card, they run out and they jack the thing all the way up to the credit card limit. Okay, $10,000. And then Jack is like, cool, minimum payments, sounds like what I'm going to do. I'm just going to continue this forever and ever and ever. And Jill is like, you know what? I was stupid. I shouldn't have rung that thing up to $10,000. And so she busts her rear end. She gets 2 or 3 jobs and she pays as much as she possibly can down on that credit card to get that payment down. And it's paid off. And it's at about that point that I show up and I'm like, you know what? Anybody in my class who has an outstanding credit card debt, I'm going to pay it off. And Jack still has the full $10,000. I'm going to pay $10,000 off for him. And you know what? Jill is rightfully going to be a little bit ticked. This is the issue with should we pay off the state debts or should central government pay off the state debts or not. Okay. And what we're going to end up doing is kind of a compromise. Hamilton gets his plan, which he often does in these debates. We're going to pay off the state debts, or the central government's going to pay off the state debts. But because the South feels like, wait a minute, we already did this, they're also going to get something they want. You see, up until this point, the capital of the United States was in New York City. And so what the agreement is that if we pay off the debts of the North and South Carolina, in order for the South to get something, why don't we move the capital a little bit further down? Okay, so now it's right on the border between Pennsylvania and, between Maryland and Virginia. Ignore I said that. Between Maryland and Virginia. Okay, it's right there between the North and the South. It's going to be perfect. Okay, wouldn't you know it? Another issue is going to come up. This is an issue of should the federal government set up a national bank to keep its money in? Okay, the idea is we don't want to put money in a bunch of these, state or regional banks. That's kind of weird. Why don't we put our money in our own bank? Hamilton, he's the money guy, Secretary of the Treasury. He's like, yeah, that's what we ought to do. Congress should set up a national bank. It should store the United States money. And he's like, if we ever get in a point where we need to stimulate the economy, we can loan more money out to small businesses. They'll be able to grow. This is just a really good plan. And Jefferson's like, yeah, no, that sounds great. It sounds like a really good plan, except that the Constitution doesn't say anything about Congress having the power to set up a bank. So we shouldn't start a bank. Where would you get that idea? This is going to highlight one of the big differences between these two men. Hamilton's got this pragmatic approach. Let's just get it done. If we need to stretch the Constitution, in fact, there's a clause in there called the Elastic Clause. It says Congress can do whatever is necessary and proper. Hamilton's like, let's use it. Jefferson says, no, we believe in limited government. We don't stretch the Constitution. We only do what it specifically lets us do. Well, guess what? And I know I got ahead of myself. Okay, that's the Elastic Clause is a super important idea. You need to make sure you've got it. Actually, it should be down at the bottom of that Excel sheet. So if you don't want to type all that in, you're in good shape. The bank is going to be created, but they agree they're going to have to renew it every so many years. Okay? We have to reevaluate, is this a good idea or not? So now we have 2 in a row that Hamilton wins. The third issue that comes up is the issue of a tariff. You see, we have all these little baby businesses in the United States that are growing up, textile industries, let's say. Well, the question is, I'll come back to this, don't worry. The question is, how do our little American textile companies compete with British-made textile companies, okay? Textiles, not companies, textiles that are coming in. So if the American one is $4 a roll and the British one is $4 a roll, you just kind of buy whichever one you happen to see first. You don't really give it much thought. So a tariff is a tax on goods that come in from other countries. And so in this case, the example says, why don't we put a 25% tariff of $1 on the price of the British one? So now I'm looking at the two, and the American one is $4 and the British one is $5. If otherwise the quality is about the same, well, heck, I'm going to buy the American one. And if I don't buy the American one, the government pockets that dollar and they can use it to help grow the government or grow the country's economy. Okay? That's Hamilton's idea. He's like, yes, a tariff is fantastic. It's a win-win. It helps our little baby businesses. It gets us more money if people are buying goods from other countries. Jefferson's like, what? Oh, hold on. He says, let's not have a tariff. That's a bad idea. Okay? He says, we have these farmers out in the middle of nowhere who don't have a lot of options at their stores. And sometimes all they have, just because of how our trade routes work, is British goods. And if we suddenly put a tariff on them, it's going to jack up the prices of these farmers that live out in the middle of nowhere. This is a bad, bad deal. Okay? this tariff is going to crush the farmers. It's only going to help the big businessmen grow even bigger. And you know what? Jefferson's finally going to win one. We're not going to pass a tariff. We're not going to increase taxes on imported goods. But this is an issue that's going to come up again and again and again. In fact, it's come up as recently as the last 4 years under Donald Trump. Okay, there's a question of should we increase the tariff on certain goods coming from outside of the country? Here's another issue. Hamilton is thinking about things he doesn't like. And Hamilton doesn't like people who are drinking a lot. He also is trying to find out more ways to bring in money into the government. He says, here's what we can do. Why don't we tax whiskey? Okay? That way fewer people will drink, and if they do drink, the government gets more cash because we're taxing it. And Jefferson's like, no, we're not going to tax people's whiskey. He says, whiskey comes from grain. Grain comes from farmers. They depend on the sale of that whiskey. A lot of times they'd actually convert it into whiskey in order to transport it more easily, because I guess whiskey's less likely to blow off the wagon as you're going over the mountains or whatever, right? So Jefferson says, don't do this. This is a really bad move. And Hamilton's like, what could go wrong? Well, they do decide to tax whiskey, and wouldn't you know it, Jefferson is exactly right. The farmers are ticked. So farmers in Pennsylvania are like, we're not going to pay that tax, okay? You want it? You're going to have to send an army after us to do it. We remember what happened under like Shays' Rebellion. Remember we had this whole thing before where Shay and his boys weren't getting the money that they were promised in a pension, and the government couldn't do anything to stop them. They're like, this is going to be the same. This is a test for the Constitution. Okay? And by the way, people confuse Shays' Rebellion and this Whiskey Rebellion all the time. So let's get the Whiskey Rebellion real clear in our heads. So under the Whiskey Rebellion, we have farmers refusing to pay the federal whiskey tax. And so George Washington is like, oh, no, they don't. So he hops on a horse. He puts together a number of troops because now under the Constitution, we can pay these guys because we can tax things. He heads out there and they're like, whoa, we're not going to fight George Washington. Like, that's the George Washington, like the president of the country, the guy who the British surrendered to at Yorktown. And everybody goes home. So, guys, yeah, the Whiskey Rebellion is different than Shays' Rebellion in that the causes are different. But Shays' Rebellion is going to highlight how weak the Articles of Confederation is because they can't tax, they can't enforce jack squat, and we have these farms getting... we have these, because farms are being foreclosed on, Shay goes to shut down courthouses, and they can't do anything to stop it. In the Whiskey Rebellion, George Washington shows up on a horse because the Constitution allows Congress to tax, and they can put all this together. George Washington's going to collect the taxes, and the situation is diffused. Now, again, this is straight out of Hamilton, okay? I'll have a link in Classroom, I think, to a clean version of one of the rap battles. It's I forget the name of the track, but it's pretty cool, and it'll help you remember everything we've talked about today. Now, this has been building. Every time Hamilton says something, Jefferson disagrees. So these guys are going to split at this point. These guys can't really bear to be in the same room with each other, and so they're gonna start to line up under not just ideological, I sort of like Hamilton or Jefferson. Now they're going to have parties. Hamilton's followers say, we like the idea of a strong federal government. Okay? We want the power to enforce stuff. We want the power to have a bank, whatever. So they call themselves the Federalists. And these guys overwhelmingly are industry and plantation owners. Okay? Guys who stand to benefit from the government saying, hey, we're going to have, an import tax on stuff. Okay? So industry and plantation owners. And these guys interpret the Constitution loosely. We'll talk about what that means in a second. Jefferson's followers are just beside themselves about pretty much everything Hamilton and the Federalists say. Jefferson's followers believe in a limited central government. We don't want it to be too strong. We want the states to have lots of power. Okay? We want to listen to the people. That's the idea of the democratic there. We want to hear the people's concerns, not just the concerns of the few. And Republicans, they want a republic in which these people get to vote for folks to go represent them. Jefferson believes in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which we'll come back to in a second. And he is overwhelmingly going to support the common man, which are the farmers, the agricultural sector. He says these are the people that the country is built on. Let's talk about this last idea of strict and loose construction, and we're done. Strict construction, okay? This is Jefferson, which I know that's confusing. I should have flipped them because I've been doing Hamilton, Jefferson. But strict construction is Jefferson. And he says you should read the Constitution literally. What it says is what you should do, and you should do no more. You say, I still don't understand. Hold on, we'll get there. Loose construction or loose interpretation of the Constitution says we should use that elastic clause to sort of bend the Constitution a little bit and do whatever Congress thinks is necessary and proper. So here's the example that I use in class. Your parents go away for the weekend, and this is outside of the coronavirus, okay? So forget that for a minute, if that's possible. They say, we're leaving for the weekend. We don't want any parties in the house, okay? No parties in the house. Well, if you're a strict constructionist, or you interpret their words strictly, this is what your weekend is going to look like, okay? You're going to hang out in front of the TV, hopefully not staticky like this dude. You're just going to watch it. Nobody's coming over because what they've said is nobody's coming to the house. That's the deal. That's what they mean. That's what they said. Nobody's coming. But if you're a loose constructionist or loose interpretationist, you're like, well, they said nobody could come to or come in the house. What about outside of the house? And you can throw a big old shindig. And you didn't actually go against what they said because that's not what they said. Some of you guys think very much like this. This is the difference between strict and loose construction of the Constitution, okay? Those are the notes today. It might be a little bit long, but I think that's an important concept for you to get under your belt, okay? If you have any questions, shoot me an email. I'll see you next time.